Hello and welcome to the forum. I'm John Mattison. This week, my guest is Judith February. She's someone you've seen on your TV screens, read her articles in many places. Her most recent book is Turning and Turning, Exploring the Complexities of South African Democracy. Judith has a BA, an LLB, and a Master's of Law from the University of Cape Town. Judith, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Judith, before we get to the present sensitive political moment in South Africa, I want to take you back. You from an interesting family. Your cousin was Basil February.
My father's cousin, yes. He was Basil February, who died in southern Rhodesia on his way back he was the first, coloured person to die as an MK guerrilla. And then fled South Africa in 1963 or 4. So yes, he was an interesting person, but died too young, of course, and one of the many casualties of the struggle against apartheid.
Yes. Have you ever researched where your surname February comes from?
I haven't really. I mean, my uncle, the other interesting person that I do mention in my book, Vernon February, he was a professor at Leiden in African Studies, and unfortunately he also died far too young, but he'd been doing quite a lot of research on the family tree, and some of those papers are scattered around the world, but they might also some of them are at the UWC Mayibuya Center. But obviously they're slave names, so they are surnames, and you'll find them quite often in the Western Cape. So months in which slaves were freed. So that's as much as I know. I mean, that is it's another book and an interesting project to write about that. Yes,
absolutely. Now you got to the University of Cape Town around the early 90s or late 80s when the things were opening up. What was it like then?
It was interesting. I mean, John, I must say, I can't claim to have been very actively involved in student politics at the time. I think that I'd always grown up in a family where, certainly from my father's side, he had Basil February, who had died as an MK guerrilla. That was always kind of front and center in terms of an awareness of what was happening in the country. We'd also had my uncle Vernon, who had gone into exile. He had left South Africa. In fact, he was at the University of Cape Town, and in those days with a permit to be allowed in. He was a debating champion, incidentally, as well. But they didn't want him to compete in the debate at Stellenbosch University because he was classified coloured. They'd lived in Somerset West. They had, he was making that trip to UCT every day on a train and learning all South African languages while he was at it. But so he then went into exile and was very involved with the ANC in Amsterdam. He was, he hoisted the first South African flag from his apartment in Amsterdam in '94, and had an array of people coming and going into his flat. So he led a very interesting life. He sneaked back to South Africa under sort of surveillance for my grandmother's funeral, which was before I was born. And so that was always part and parcel of growing up, in a sense. And his books, which were banned. He once came to South Africa and there were all these writers at our house, but it was all clandestine and so on. People would sort of do raids to ensure that his poems weren't read, things like that. So by the time I always had a strong sense of kind of that there was an injustice was going on, of course. My childhood was sort of rather, it was, I suppose, unusual for those times. I mean, I went to private school, so it was a multiracial school. And so in a sense, our upbringing was it was unusual for those times. So we were in the 80s, we were staying over at each other's houses, we were doing all those things, we were friends. And so race, in a sense, and I think our parents were quite interesting in the way in which they talked to us about race and what was going on. And we sort of lived. And then I went to UCT, but then of course you're faced with with a very different time. I mean, I got to UCT in 1988, so it was a time of tremendous flux in South Africa, and there was a lot going on at the university. But I suppose my choice of studying law was part of that kind of wanting to set the world to rights and wanting to see something better and something different. And so there were turbulent times, also times where, you know, there were bombs going off and there were all kinds of things happening socially. And so I mean, I do remember now, you know, Cameron Dugmore, who was at the Law Students' Council at the time, and you remember that politics. And so I think for me, it was really about trying to get to using law as an instrument to change things. And of course, in the teaching of law at the time, it was a really interesting time to be studying law because you were moving from one system to another, and you were trying to look at what might a constitution look like if we were to have one. And so those times, it was quite an interesting time. I graduated in '93. I mean, what a time to graduate. And, you know, looking now at our classes on administrative law, looking at as I said, what a constitution might look like. Very different, but, you know, we had some really interesting teachers, Hugh Corder, Christina Murray, who themselves then were part of that constitution making process. And of course, were part of all of it from 1990 on especially. So it was a, you know, the saying, what a time to be alive. We lived through all that history, and it was a remarkable time to be a student.
Right. Well, we're going to come back to UCT in a minute because you talk about it in your book, but just to bring us up to date, after law, you practiced law for a bit, went into IDASA, the Institute for Democracy, monitoring Parliament, you were in think tanks, you've been on boards, and you're now on the interim board of Cricket South Africa.
Yes. Can
you say anything about that?
Well, yes, I can say that it's quite interesting because in a way, some of it ties back to our family history. So I come from a family on both sides, my mother's side and my father's side, who are cricketers. My father left, he was a very good cricketer, played in those days, obviously it was segregated, so the 1960s. My father then, along with Rishdi Majid, the Abet brothers, they went to play cricket in the Lancashire Leagues in England. My father spent 2 years there, but then came back. And it was so for me, you know, I've always grown up with cricket. I've always grown up with it in my head. My mother's father was a Western Province wicketkeeper. His brother Dan Hurling was a Captain Basil Oliveira. They were fine cricketers. So all of us. And my father and all of his brothers, bar two, and there were 6 of them, played for Western Province. So we come from a family which is steeped in cricket. And every New Year's, you know, we make the ritual journey to Newlands. And so I've always grown up with it in my ear, in my head, all over. And so it was interesting. And then I've written about the governance failures in cricket because, of course, it bothered me deeply because, you know, here was, on a personal level, my father and so many of his generation who were denied the opportunity to play for their country. And, you know, we're playing in the Lancashire Leagues and sort of triple jerseys in May. But you know, here I saw the game was in dysfunction, captured in a sense. And so I'd written quite a lot about that. And so when I got the call to ask whether I would want to be on this interim board, I didn't hesitate for a minute. Because it's part of who I am, is you know, part of who we are as a cricketing family. And so it's and then here we are on this board. And I think, John, it's saddening to see institutions that are degraded and torn apart by dysfunction. And it doesn't have to be this way, because there certainly are people of all hues in our country who are able to manage and run cricket as it should be run, not only for now, but for future generations. We're custodians of a game which is a common good. And so that's driven me on this board to try to write things. It hasn't been easy. There are all kinds of forces at play outside of the board, and it's a form of politics. It's been a form of capture of this board, and there's a fight back from people who have a lot to lose from a cleanup operation and from an independent board. So so that's where we are. We're coming to the end of our term, and it's been quite a whirlwind 6 months, I must say. It started out as 3 and it's now 6, and we've all worked really hard. But at the end of the day, within a limited time, one can do so much, and then you have to be able to try and hand over to a new board, which will hopefully take things further.
Yes, and of course we're now just sort of nearing the end of the process. If everything goes well, you will be handing over a better organization than you found. But I guess it was. Did you find it was as bad as you expected, or even worse?
I think it was worse than I had expected. I've always stayed away from in my work life. I've always stayed away from any sort of working in any sort of government or public institutions. The nearest I got was the Human Science Research Council, where I was director of a program. And that's, I was there for 14 months of just too much bureaucracy for me, too little focusing on the real sort of issues around research and so on. And I found that, one's talents are better used elsewhere. But I think that, well, that was certainly the case at the time when I was there. But there's been a change in leadership at that institution. But it was worse than I thought. That particularly, I think, in terms of the toxicity within the organization, the fear and the loathing. And I think that where that comes from is when you have weak management, and there is a sort of there are repercussions to that, but also that the amount of damage one can do by hiring the wrong people. There was a forensic report, for example, the Funditsi report, which details all the maladministration and so on, and things that happened which shouldn't have happened. And one, it's disappointing, but the repercussions of that behavior and those actions, those are severe on an organization. And good people leave, they're gotten rid of. It's a very difficult environment in which to work. But I think what I can say is what it also has shown me is that, as in all of these institutions, South African institutions, I'm quite sure, Eskom, SARS, all of those institutions, there are core people who are good people and who just get on with doing their jobs. And
Judith, on that slightly more hopeful sentence, we need to take a break. We'll be right back with Judith February. And we're back talking to Judith February, who is, among other things, on the board of the interim board of Cricket South Africa. Judith, we were just finishing on cricket. I want to get on to politics, or direct politics, shall we say, rather than sports politics. But what happened at cricket, it seems to have happened so many places. We know in government and state institutions, but I don't know if you saw, I think it was last week in the Daily Maverick, there were reports about the railway system in South Africa, very close to collapse. Firefighters, where we saw the tragedy at the University of Cape Town at a time when one report said 50 fire trucks should have been working and only 5 were. I think that was in Johannesburg, not Cape Town. The Red Cross is in trouble. The damage seems to be far more widespread than I think even the pessimists thought.
John, I agree with that. And last year, when I've written the article about cricket,
Yes.
I likened it to capture, because it's the same playbook that you're seeing, but it's just the different context. So it happens to be sport, but it's the same playbook of the lack of leadership, corruption, etc., hollowing out the institution of talent, and then it becomes unfit for purpose. And President Zuma, former President Zuma, of course, was masterful at this, because everything starts at the top. And so once you have the president who is behaving in a particular way and who is himself captured and compromised, and we've seen enough evidence of the Zondo Commission, dramatic evidence,
Yes.
to understand that fully. We also had the former public protector's Secure and Comfort report on Nkandla and the sort of egregious spending there. So we understand what happens. We understand how tenders happen. We understand the greed. And that is indeed replicated in all of our institutions. And I think you mentioned the South African Red Cross. I was particularly saddened by that story that I read on Daily Maverick, because it just seems as if, you know, it is then the tentacles of poor leadership, of maladministration, the wrong people for in particular positions of authority, and then the fear and the loathing and the toxicity. It does seem to be everywhere. Whichever institutions one looks at, you know, even in churches, even at schools, and it is breaking down the fabric of our society, and we need to be in a position now where we should try to rebuild these institutions that have been gutted.
Right. I mean, we can't gloss over the damage that's been done, and it's, of course, much easier to destroy an institution than to rebuild it. But it does seem that in the case of cricket, there does seem to be some progress, and it does have a lot to do with the Minister, Nati Ntetwa, of Minister of Sport, Recreation, Arts and Culture, who had to be tough, and that seemed to have been the only way.
Yes, and I do think the Minister's intervention in this case, and I know there are many people who who say we shouldn't have government intervention in sport, because of course we come from a particular apartheid history, and that history is painful, and government intervention, sport and politics is always
and it was improper interference.
Exactly. And so in this moment, I think there was no other alternative for the Minister.
Yes.
Because it was quite clear that the leadership of cricket wouldn't course correct by itself.
Yes.
And what I think, John, the Minister has done very well and wisely is that he's left our board to be an independent board.
Yes.
To do what we needed to do, and to implement the mandate of cleaning it up and getting us to a point where we have an amended constitution for the organisation. So he's been very good about really stepping back. That, you know, where he's had to come in, he's come in with the sort of stick, because there'd be no other options. And so I think it is, you know, at the end of this our stint as the interim board, I think there are many lessons to be learned about from the past 6 months.
Yeah. Now, you've been writing in your columns lately a lot about the judiciary. And of course, we've seen the judiciary, perhaps along with the media, as sort of the most resilient parts of our society, and the judiciary obviously buffeted by a strong constitution, has been one of the best and most resilient. But you're also starting to have some concerns.
I am, because I think that if we look at the past couple of weeks, and particularly the Judicial Services Commission and the way in which it's been chaired by Chief Justice Mogoeng,
yes.
There certainly is cause for concern. But this is not a new concern. I think it's been a while coming, where we've seen the Judicial Services Commission, the level of questioning, for example, the understanding of how the courts work, the judiciary itself, that has been lacking in some of the questioning. For example, it's also become deeply personal. It is also, in my view, become slanted far too much on only a candidate's transformation credentials, and I say that because it feels to me limited. So it feels to me as if, for example, a white candidate would be immediately almost disadvantaged. You have fine candidates, and it's not good to mention names, but someone like Jeff Budlander, who happens to be a white man, but who probably has done more for socioeconomic rights jurisprudence than most other counsel out there. And, you know, that somebody like Jeff Budlander could not ascend to the bench. It might be a trite example, but it's a travesty. But it's not only happening, I think, to white judges. I think it's happening to many. We've seen some fine black, Indian coloured candidates who've been put forward and who haven't made the cut. And that, to me, is quite sad. It seems that, particularly in the last batch of interviews, that there hasn't been the rigor, and it's some of it led by the Chief Justice as being deeply personal against the candidates, and very little
on their
of their judicial record
Yes.
and case law and how that works.
Right.
And that to me has been disappointing.
And now when we're going to get a new Chief Justice soon, and I assume that appointment is going to be absolutely critical.
Yes, I mean, I read an article last week in the Daily Maverick, and I said, we can forget many other things, so that President Ramaphosa has to do, but appointing a Chief Justice this year is going to be probably his most important legacy appointment, because the person who heads it up shapes the court. John, if we look at the previous Chief Justices, Arthur Chaskalson, Pius Lunga, Ishmael Mohammed, for a brief moment, Sandile Ngobo, and that was, we put him in a sort of separate category, but they shaped the court. Arthur Chaskalson shaped a court with intellectual heft by dint of who he was, how he led the court with a meticulous, fastidious approach. And that's what one wants from a Chief Justice. To me, also, the greatest post-apartheid tragedy is that somebody like former Deputy Chief Justice Mosesaneki was overlooked. But then, former President Zuma was trying to craft a court of his own image. And that didn't quite work for him, interestingly enough. So for all our criticisms of Chief Justice Mogoeng, he has held the line by and large, but I think his behavior lately has become rather erratic, and probably when he goes, it will be the time for him to go.
Yes. Now, we just have a minute and a half before we break, but I've seen some of your writing, and I think it's in your book too, about Dikgang Mosesaneki. You were with him overseas, and you were with him in front of university students, and you had some extraordinary experiences with him.
Well, the overseas, he was delivering a lecture. I was in Washington at the time in 2012. I was on a spring fellowship.
Yes.
With the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, and he was delivering a lecture at Georgetown Law, and it was wonderful because he is somebody who has the gravitas of the position, but also it was very interesting seeing it from an American perspective.
Right.
How Americans understood and were interested in the way in which we were crafting a very new jurisprudence on socioeconomic rights. And of course, Judge Mosesaneki was an intrinsic part of that, and also part of the first elections. I mean, he is a fine, fine jurist, and there are greater people than me who've said it. So, and his judgments speak for themselves. But the interaction that I've had with him was in conversation with him in respect of his first book, My Own Liberator, which is, and John, I'm sure you've read it, but it is,
sure.
For people who haven't read it, it really is a beautifully written book about his childhood, but for me, it also talks about the role of teachers in shaping one's life. And he's written beautifully about his life, and then All Rise, which is the follow-up to that, is obviously about his life on the bench. But it was a very interesting book launch because, of course, we were confronted at that book launch by fallers, Fees Must Fall.
Judith, I'm going to interrupt you. I want to hear that story after the break. And we're back talking to Judith February. I want to hear very briefly your story about former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Mosesaneki when students started challenging him.
Well, it was very interesting because, of course, it was at the time when the student protests around Fees Must Fall were at the height of what was happening at university campuses across the country. And it was just, I think what stood out was, so we had this book launch and everything went very well until I was doing an in-conversation with him, and students started getting up and started attacking the court, the Constitution, attacking the basis for being, and it's the old playbook. And in a sense, John, some of it is understandable, because what students were saying is, we talk about this constitution, but there's still poverty, there are deep levels of inequality. And so, what have we gained from it? And why should we protect and defend it? And what about the land question? Because your court has never dealt with the land issue. And it was quite funny, because I found myself, I'd written so much about fees must fall at UCT. I felt really strongly that the destruction of books and buildings, and I felt really strongly about. And
but just to interrupt you, I mean, your point was not that students don't have grievances. Those grievances are real. There are hungry students in the university. I think what you were saying was that they were targeting the wrong institution.
Absolutely. And so, for example, one of the students got up that evening, and it was quite interesting, because I could feel myself getting rather impatient. But Judge Mosesaneki, being who he is, said, "Judith, don't worry, I'll handle this." And then, carefully took the student through how the court works, and particularly on the land issue. He said, we never got a case which dealt with land. So the Constitutional Court doesn't just pluck matters out from the air and decide to...
But of course, that is an indictment, not of the court, but it is an indictment of somebody, perhaps the government, that no cases have been brought.
Yes, absolutely. And an indictment I thought, as I listened to the students, on the failure to educate about the Constitution, right, about rights, about how this court works, and about how the document is aspirational in many cases, but without it. I mean, Mandela said, this is a court on which hinges the future of our democracy. He was exactly right. And his ability to submit himself to the authority of the courts, I think, is one of the most important moments in his presidency.
But perhaps you could criticize Mandela not for that, where he behaved admirably, but he was in charge of a government that didn't bring those cases.
Well, one could. I suppose in his defense, one would say there was a lot going on, John, at the time.
It was early days.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. But also civil society organizations, did we all drop the ball in terms of looking at certain cases that we might have elevated to the court and didn't? And I think that there was a lesson in that, and Mosesaneki took this young student through all of this. But I think what struck me was not the grievance, but the anger. And there is the right, sort of seeds of a kind of disrespect and a disregard, which I think we see come full circle when Dali Mpofu tells his fellow colleague to shut up and talks over the head of Judge Zondo. And that lack of respect is something which I think, as a society, we need to deal with.
Yes. Just to finish with the judiciary, the last question is about the Western Cape Judge President, John Prof. It seems our institutions, and I must say you see this in America too, where you have corruption, people are able to delay the process endlessly. I mean, this should have come to a head ages ago, and yet he's still sitting on the Judicial Services Commission, even after findings against him.
It's one would say, if you were writing a headline, outrageous. That somebody is able to, who's facing serious charges of misconduct against it. I mean, what is happening in the Western Cape High Court is completely unacceptable. You seem to have a sort of rule by fiat from the Judge President's office. There seems to be a lot of improper conduct at the very least. When one is admitted as an attorney, you have to make an averment to say that you're a fit and proper person. That applies, of course, to judges. And, one wants to ask what happened to fit and proper. If even half of what is in the public domain is true, then the Western Cape High Court is in a crisis. And Judge Hlophe, if he had the sort of conscience, I suppose, he would step down, because his position really is untenable.
But where are the institutions to stop this?
Well, precisely. And the Judicial Services Commission, and I think here, when one is criticizing the JSC, led by Chief Justice Mogoeng, that this matter has dragged out for 13 years. You know, the accountability, we all forget what the initial issue was. And so the institutions need to be strengthened. But also, I think it is what I think has been good about this latest round of interviews is that people have been far more, a lot of it's been broadcast, people have far more have a greater understanding. There are organizations like Judges Matter, for example, which are bringing information to people in real time. And so there's far greater scrutiny now, I think, than ever before of the work of the JSC. And I think if anything good has come out of this, then then I think that would be a good thing. But these institutions work very slowly, and accountability in South Africa, it's to get to that point. And we see it in the MPA, for example. And we really do need to make, precisely, we need to make it front and center. And leadership matters. The Chief Justice's leadership of the JSC, and to speed things up, that matters.
I want to touch on the University of Cape Town. In your book, you describe the University of Cape Town, which you have a unique perspective on because you were a student there at a time of transition and you're a constitutionalist and a legal academic. You described UCT as having a currency of fear.
Well, of course, my book was written, you know, at the time, also in the aftermath of Fees Must Fall. Right. So it's 2018-19. So it's, you know, that I was describing what it was at the time. And certainly there is a moment, I think, and I'm hoping that the university would have come to a moment of introspection with regard to what happened. I think in South Africa, John, we have these moments where, you know, we have great rupture. So the Fallist movement was very interesting for the way in which it was organized, for what the things it achieved and so on. But there was a fear and a violence which was at its heart. And then we have a very uncanny ability in our country to simply move on once things have quietened down, because we're on to dealing with the next crisis. And I do think that we need to unpack and understand what happened during that moment, because it does inform everything that happens thereafter. And I'm not sure that that's been done. There's a lot of talk at the university around, you know, this commission looking at issues of transformation. I'm not sure how inclusive that is. I'm not sure. And I think that there is a lot of silencing. And there's a lot of silence in our country for many people because they feel, and particularly at the time of Fees Must Fall, people who felt, black and white, who felt that they couldn't be part of the conversation because of the culture of fear, because of the toxicity, because of the violence. And it is something that we need to be able to have a mature conversation about.
What does this mean for our universities? You know, Professor Jonathan Jansen, one of our most distinguished education academics and former head of Free State University, he's quite pessimistic about our universities. He looks at the universities in Africa and he looks at the ones here and he's quite pessimistic. You say that the academics feel besieged, the trust has been broken. What do you see happening? Is this going to be repaired or is it going to get worse?
I always, John, you know, if one looks at it, to live in South Africa, you have to, as I say in my book, be able to see and unsee, and, you know, one can look at the glass half empty all the time. I do see at the University of Cape Town, I do see some sort of shoots of people trying to overcome some of what happened and trying to be part of a more constructive approach after the Fees Must Fall movement. I haven't been involved closely enough, so I can't comment. But I think that there's going to be more schism before we actually get to a point, if we do, of things being repaired. I believe that the concern should be about not only universities, but about our schooling system in general. Because if you're going to have a very weak schooling system, it will obviously impact on what happens at universities and the quality of students one gets and the pressure that there is on universities also to deliver degrees in an environment where the economy also needs that, but also an environment where we don't have tertiary education is limited. So for instance, the university is just about the only place that you can go, but we have a very limited imagination with regard to anything else that one might do after school. So it's all of that put together, and I think you need a preternatural degree of wisdom to be able to navigate all that as a vice chancellor of a university. So these things are always bubbling under the surface, and for me, the university should be places of excellence, not of mediocrity. And one sees too much mediocrity coming out of universities, and not to denigrate those individuals who I know who are working very hard and doing excellent research at all universities across South Africa. But we have to be careful about the slide to mediocrity because it replicates itself in institutions.
Judith, we have to take a break. The time is going too fast. When we come back, I want to talk about leadership and politics. Judith, I suppose the segue from your point about universities into politics is a lack of leadership. I mean, for instance, if you and I have worked in Parliament a long time. If you go outside Parliament, the main statue you see is one to General Louis Botha. Now, yes. I mean, if I were a president or in government or in Parliament, I would say that's surely the first thing to move aside, not destroy, put it somewhere else, maybe include it in some other sort of historic place. But I don't think anybody in South Africa cares particularly about General Louis Botha. So our leadership seems to fall down. And then, of course, students come and say, well, why have you got Louis Botha there? You don't know what you're doing. And that applies in politics too. So I guess the question is, what do you see going forward? We had Tony Leon on the show a little while ago, and he said a lot of controversial things. But one thing I thought was hard to dismiss, he said, until you see a split in the ANC, you won't be able to fix South Africa. Is that true, or is there a way to save it?
Well, the question is, yes, I've written many times that the ANC as it's currently constituted is unfit for purpose. Right. I see a lot because you're trying to reconcile, if you think about it in very crude terms, the goodies and the baddies, or the Ramaphosa kind of reform wing, and then the radical economic transformers, who really are simply a bunch of people who have either criminal records or they want to loot the state. Their names are well known to us. So if you have this irreconcilable difference, so all you're trying to do is always fit a square peg into a round hole, and it results in a deep paralysis. I suspect that, though, for the ANC, that's obviously, we know that it's an uncomfortable place to go because it's unity über alles, despite the fact that the entire country can see that it's torn apart by factionalism. So it's a very tricky thing, but and I don't think it will split in the immediate future. And so how do we move forward from that? Is, well, elections. And I see far more coalition government in our future, which to me has its own dangers. And so I think actually, ironically, South Africa needs an ANC which is functional. And also opposition politics, John. I mean, we follow it and it's weak. And yes. So it's just, there's a lack of imagination. Also, you have young people who are alienated from politics and who are seeking other ways to understand the world. And that's not unique to South Africa. But your point about leadership, I talk about it in my book at the end when I talk about reimagining South Africa, which is a long-term project. It's not going to happen overnight. And leadership, it's tried to talk about it because it sounds strongman and top down, but it really does matter. We saw the Public Protector's Office, when it had good leadership under Advocate Thuli Madonsela. We look at it now, SARS, one could go on and on and on. And so our universities, it really does matter who heads something up and whether that person
this year is local elections, and if we all remember 5 years ago, the last local elections were a very dramatic time for exactly the reasons you described. You had a strong opposition presence, at least under Mmusi Maimane, even though things didn't work out in the long run, but he had captured the public imagination. There was also a drive to challenge corruption and challenge President Zuma. This time, it looks like these elections could be quite boring. Certainly on the inter-party level, is the most interesting part what happens inside the ANC.
It usually is, because, you know, one wants to see, you want to also look at how many young people, for example, come out to vote. You want to see whether the ANC is going to carry the consequences for poor governance in places where, you know, South Africa, I saw a clip yesterday or the day before of Jessie Duarte mobilizing people to change the name of William Nicol Drive. And one wonders whether she would mobilize people to, you know, on pit latrine toilets, erratic water supply, erratic electricity supply, and so on. The ANC has a lot to answer for at local government elections. What will people's apathy, will it mean that they don't go to vote, and particularly young people who so much want change, and where do they channel that energy? But I'm also interested in the opposition, because the DA appears to have lost its way, frankly. And I think that, you know, John Steenhuisen would be a fine person to be, you know, in Parliament, and he was very good at rules and understanding the process. But as a national leader, yes, as chief whip, as a national leader, you know, I really think that that he's floundering, unfortunately. And then you've got Helen Zille in the background, so this doesn't make for a very a good mix. And so it will be interesting to see how people respond to that, because it will be a test. And then, of course, for the EFF's brash and crude politics.
You know, I lived in Washington a while, and you've spent time there too. And what is really strikingly different from here is how much policy debate there is. I see you've been in think tanks where the whole discussion is about how do you fix a policy problem. And that's what I don't see coming from the parties, either government or opposition. I think the hope that I see in South Africa at the moment, especially during the time of COVID, has been in the webinars, in the think tanks and institutes that are starting to bring out people who are, I mean, this week, in fact, there's been a conference on reimagining the public service brought out by some people from Anthony Butler and Ivor Chipkin. And those seem to be the most interesting things happening in South Africa. And that's hopefully where we'll start to see some politicians emerge.
Indeed, but also, John, the kind of grassroots politics, I think where we've got to is a sort of stalemate of protest. And, you know, if they as individuals, people have said, you know, if we protest, that's when they hear us and we come in. My former colleague, Ibrahim Fakir, has done a lot of research on this. And it's across the country. And so we are involved in this sort of protest, and then a kind of appeasement, and then protest again, because we don't get to the heart of fixing things because of the state of the ANC. If you look at, for example, the energy debates, you know, in Gwedi Montage, how slow he's been, and to bring about reform in the energy sector. And you just, that paralysis is those continuous debates within the ANC. It's just a kind of navel gazing as opposed to doing anything. So you're paralyzed by your division. And I see more of that. I don't see the ANC splitting. I think that the radical economic transformers understand that if they were to break away from the ANC, that actually, you know, then you've got to present yourself to the populace. And there's not much to present. Yes, there's not much to present there. And we've seen the way in which other COPE went, for example. So, and that was a more decent part of the ANC that, you know, not survive. Correct. And so very hard to survive. And so I don't see it splitting. Whether it should split, so for me, it's when Magashule says we will split from the ANC if this, that, and the other doesn't happen. I sort of think, well, let's see how that works out. Go ahead, because actually the voters will make their own decisions. And wouldn't it be great if you had a sort of progressive part of the ANC and other individuals from the other political parties, whether it's the DA and so on, coming together and forming a proper political party which is about social democracy, which is about reforming the state. That, I think, would be a tantalizing prospect. But we are caught in our old ways of thinking. And you're right, we don't have the policy debates that we should, but I think it is more about, in South Africa also, the political parties linking up more to citizens. There's a massive gap. And, how do we find our citizen voice again after so many years of just protest or silence? That, I think, is a question for us.
When you look at what's going on in Washington, I follow Joe Biden quite closely. And of course, he was a really a mainstream politician virtually his entire career. And yet suddenly he's becoming what appears to be a really transformative president who's moving fast, who's sort of understood the crisis of the moment. We all were so hopeful about in the days of Ramaphosa, about Cyril Ramaphosa. We've got just 60 seconds left. I wanted to ask you, are you disappointed in President Ramaphosa? Do you still think he could do a Biden?
Your point about Biden is right. I think he's turning out to be a transformational president, and probably because of his age, he's got one shot at this. What has disappointed me about President Ramaphosa is the very slow way in which he has often responded to crises, and sometimes seen as being a step behind. So, for example, on the PPE corruption, he was just a step behind the public mood. But I also understand that he has got a mammoth task ahead of him. And for me, my view is that if not Ramaphosa, then who? And so I think he is our best bet. And he does understand global governance. He understands the modern world. And so I think he is our best bet at being, at reforming and at bringing about some form of stability within our institutions. So, of course, some aspects of his presidency have been disappointing. And which is why I think citizens should never put all their faith in leadership. We should be also thinking about how we can change things and create through our activism a South Africa which meets the aspirations of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's trite, and it's often been said that we had the great period of the Mandelas and the Sobukwes and the Sisulus and so on. And I must say, my recollection, of course, it may be very unfair, is that there were strong people, or not just in the ANC, not just in the PAC. We had strong lawyers, we had strong civil society. We have so much less about that, but let's hope this is what's starting to revive. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. My guest was Judith February, author of Turning and Turning, Exploring the Complexities of South Africa's Democracy. Thanks for watching The Forum. I'm John Madison. We look forward to seeing you next week.